Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. Just one guy with a stack of comics flying solo again for a little bit. Well, Mike is a bit busier, but wanted to discuss some interesting trends we've seen lately with sales and comics, and as a result, kind of use it to look back at one of the weirdest kind of experiments and failures that's ever happened in comic books, and that is the New 52. And so you look right now, DC, their recent relaunch with All In and the Absolute Universe really seems to have made somewhat of an impact for DC in terms of their being able to be competitive with Marvel. You're seeing a lot of DC sales that are continuing, stuff like Absolute Batman, Absolute Superman. It's not just the number one issue that's doing well, but it does seem that even issues 5, 6, 7, 8 are continuing to do well, even for books like Wonder Woman with the Absolute. We've seen a couple all-in launch titles that have really rejuvenated sales. You've got Jim Lee and Jeff Loeb on Batman, and while you can say the quality may not be what folks expect, the sales certainly have. And so what's interesting is seeing this resurgence in DC. For me, it reminded me a lot of as a fan of one of my favorite eras of comic books, which was the New 52. And I kind of got used to this. I was looking the other day, I was reading this old Aquaman omnibus from the New 52, one of my favorite reads and favorite runs of any comic book character. And as I read through it, it reminded me how much I used to love what they were doing with the New 52, and it made me really wonder, why did the New 52 fail? And it's interesting in that I think the biggest reason the New 52 failed is just a lack of commitment from DC. And I'll kind of explain where I think that comes from and where I hope we can avoid this with All In and the Absolute Universe. So if you really look at it, 2011 is when the New 52 sort of starts. The Flashpoint event kicks it off. And then we basically get a reset DC continuity. And what was kind of crazy is, for the most part, unlike a lot of comic books now where they do launches and you can look at the creative teams and it kind of just seems like it's doomed from the start because of the creatives. The New 52 is kind of crazy. You've got Jeff Johns, he's working multiple books. He's on Justice League, he's on Green Lantern, he is on Aquaman. You had great artists like Jim Lee doing the main Justice League book. I mean, even Aquaman, which I'm reading here, I mean, Ivan Reis doing the main art on that. He'd be probably the best artist at DC or Marvel right now in a book, or one of the top ones if he was on an ongoing book. You look at the fact you had Scott Snyder involved, Greg Capullo involved. And while some of those folks, yes, of course, built their reputation that they have now because of the New 52, even heavy hitters like Grant Morrison were around. It was crazy the amount of talent that was concentrated on DC that came in. You got new number ones. Launching point for most of the books was pretty good. I think most of the books were around $2.99, some were around $3.99, but we didn't have, kind of this crazy $4.99, $5.99 an issue. We didn't have a whole lot of double shipping and stuff like that hurts comics now. So you had great creatives. You had a huge push, every character getting a new book. And, as we've seen with the Ultimate Universe and with the Absolute Universe, continuity resets really can be effective. Even if you go back 20 something years ago with Marvel with their first Ultimate Universe, that was a really effective sales strategy early on. And so it's interesting to see, why did the New 52 fail? Why did, after about 5 years, they had to wind it down, went into rebirth and abandoned New 52? To me, the lack of commitment to the reboot is what killed them. And that when you look at it, I think almost, and I remember this as a reader, it sort of felt doomed a little bit from the start. And that one of the biggest things is DC prior to the New 52, I was really only at that time reading Batman, Detective Comics, Green Lantern, and the two Superman titles. What was interesting is I had even sort of checked out a little bit on Batman because Bruce Wayne had been out of the role for a little bit. And so I think I was picking up like Batman Incorporated and Batman the Dark Knight, which were the Bruce Wayne titles. And so DC went with this, reboot. And what was interesting is they couldn't commit because two titles, Batman and Green Lantern, they didn't really reset. And the weird thing was DC went this timeline where they did everything pushed back and it was supposed to be everybody at the start. And so characters like Superman Lois Lane marriage was erased. He was a lot younger, a lot angrier, a little bit of a reset of his personality. Green Arrow, same deal. The goatee was gone. The marriage with Black Canary, even though that had been kind of off and on, that was erased. You saw so much of the legacy of these characters just wiped out. Characters like Cassandra Cain were gone. Stephanie Brown was gone. Wally West was erased from continuity. There was this huge reset, but with Batman and with Green Lantern, they couldn't commit to it. And this was because these were the two successful branches they had going into the New 52. And so you had this weird setup where Superman's almost back at the start, but Batman has four Robins, right? You have Green Lantern, all the Blackest Night, and all these things and these huge events that were great. All of those were still seemingly in continuity. And yet everything else was reset, where Green Arrow didn't really know Black Canary, it's Superman at the start, Wonder Woman's in a very different place. And so I think the fact that DC could not commit to the reboot because they kept dragging in the old continuity, the old stuff, I think honestly that set them up from the start to have a lot of trouble on these books. And that I think had they gone with just simply saying, hey, we're rebooting everything down to rip it down to the studs sort of thing, like they did with Superman, with Batman and Green Lantern, and really got rid of some of the sidekicks and things, I think it would have actually worked long term. As much as it would have stunk to see characters like Jason Todd, characters like Tim Drake, characters, like Starfire, things like that, erased from continuity or basically reset to zero, I think that's the only way it actually would have been successful. In that you always had this feeling around the New 52 because they wouldn't let go of like the Damian Waynes of the world, and they wanted to bring Grant Morrison back to finish Batman Incorporated, which, while an understandable decision, also was an awful thing for the entire universe. Because at the end of the day, you had some characters who were at the starting line and then other characters who seemed like they'd had their whole character journey. And so you're supposed to buy this Batman Superman dynamic, but the characters no longer made sense, right? You were supposed to buy the Green Lantern and Batman and all the Justice League would interact the same way, but it just didn't make sense across the board. There was also the weird push to make Cyborg one of the foundational members of the Justice League, which was just weird when it could have very easily been John Stewart or, another character who could have fit, because it did seem like DC was definitely pushing, the idea of wanting to make a more diverse Justice League, which not a bad idea. But you have characters like John Stewart who perfectly fit in the animated series who could have filled that role. Instead, they decided not to do that. They could have also used it as a platform to, push a character like Steel or some Black Lightning. There's multiple other characters who could have fit that role that Cyborg was. Instead, you kind of had this jumbled mix of like Teen Titans characters and sidekicks in weird places. There were weird books like Red Hood and the Outlaws that just, decided like Starfire would associate with Red Hood and Arsenal, and I think that's the biggest reason that DC failed, was they just did not let go of the past on it. And I think the sad thing is, had they actually executed this, I think the New 52 could still be going. And I think at this point, the New 52 could have been incredibly successful and really given people a new starting point. And one of the ones that I think was an interesting opportunity is, well, I believe Superman should always be with Lois Lane. They put Superman in a romantic relationship with Wonder Woman, and that really changed, or had the potential to change the dynamics of the entire DC universe. And what's funny is, because that lasted for such a short time, only 3 or 4 years, they kept bringing the Lois thing back. It just reset Superman back to the same place where I think sales wise, he again settled in at being, kind of the number 2 or 3 option at DC. And I think what would have been interesting is, if they had kept that going, you'd be 15 years in with Superman and Wonder Woman being a couple in the comic books. At this point, that would be such a significant portion of time. You'd have an entire generation of comic book fans who really would have been seeing that as like, oh, that's Superman's love interest. Instead, because they couldn't let go of the Lois Lane piece, and then even the characters that they brought back Wally West, but didn't bring it back anyway the way anybody wanted it to be. They brought back Stephanie Brown, they brought back Cassandra Cain. And it just seemed like over time what was supposed to be this refresh, this reboot, this thing that should have helped DC move on. Instead just turned into a new convoluted mess where we've added all these new dynamics, but we're bringing back all the old stuff. And overall, it collapsed under the weight of itself. But I think it's one of the greatest what ifs of all time if DC would have actually stuck with the new 52, because, we're in 2025 now, we'd be 14, 15 years into it. I think if they'd have actually committed to it, I don't think the sales would have slowed down the way that they did. Because obviously they ended the new 52 because things were struggling. But I think the biggest mistake DC made, and I think this is something that we see with comic book lines all the time. One, the idea of launching 52 titles was a huge mistake. If you had stuff like I, Vampire, Frankenstein, Agents of Shade, and Animal Man, I think Resurrection Man, and while great characters, those books were never going to last for the long term. And yes, I know sometimes you want to throw things at the wall and try to see what sticks. But I feel like DC branched off so much of their talent onto these different books where you'd have some stuff that was really, really strong while other books were failing. For instance, Green Arrow's relaunch was pretty disastrous and didn't really work all that well until they got Jeff Lemire on the title. But you had writers on books like third tier books like Swamp Thing and stuff like that that just didn't work. And again, maybe you couldn't transplant the exact Swamp Thing creative team over to Green Arrow. But I do think had they plotted out the talent a little better, launched less books, it really could have been a game changer. And I think it's one of the ultimate what ifs in comic books. And it is such a sad thing because when you go back and you read and reading this was a fantastic read, to go through. It was only 25 issues that John's lasted on the book, but it's great. You go back, there's a lot of runs that are really entertaining and fun in that new 52 era. Jeff Lemire's run on Green Arrow is fantastic. A lot of what Rob Venditti did on Green Lantern was really, really good. You had some really solid stuff from I think it was Greg Pak on Superman. At the end, it was really, really good. You had some great stuff. In the Batman front, Snyder and Capullo's run was absolutely amazing. It just will always be such a lost opportunity to DC because there's a lot of great content that was out there, especially stuff that they did with unpredictable characters. The Red Lantern Corps and the way they explored that was really interesting. Deathstroke had a couple really decent runs in the New 52. Just sadly, they could not let go of that previous continuity. And I think that it really is just so weird because you look back now at the talent that was on those books, man. That's some creators who are launching. I mean, the majority of the Ghost Machine folks, a lot of guys who are like cover artists now, were on interiors for stuff. It's crazy the amount of talent that was just concentrated into that reboot, and yet it still failed. And I do hope that DC maybe learns from that with like the Absolute Universe, and that Absolute Universe is interesting, and I think Batman's out to a really strong approach. And I know they're still doing the main continuity with this, but looking at sales and seeing how things are going, I don't think we're too far away from DC realizing the Absolute Universe might be the path going forward. I do just hope they keep it small, and that I think you're already seeing a little bit of diminishment in quality with the Absolute Universe with this second one. I think you can look at the talent that's concentrated on Absolute Batman, Absolute Superman, Absolute Wonder Woman, and thus far the Absolute Martian Manhunter book, and you see some really good things there. And while I think Absolute Flash has some potential, I think you look at something like Absolute Green Lantern, and that just doesn't have the talent in terms of what you'd expect for a major relaunch book. And so I think that's what I'm hoping they avoid is I don't want to see DC go again into the deep end of too many books, because I think ultimately what I do think DC needs to pivot to is something like the Absolute Universe just taking over everything. And that, as sad as I would be to see the main continuity go away, with the way economics are looking around comic books, the pricing, all of that stuff, I don't know how much longer DC is going to be able to hang on to the main continuity of their books. And I think the same thing's going to happen to Marvel. I do think a smaller, more curated line that has a fresh approach for readers would really, really help. And so I think, if they would go with an absolute Aquaman or an absolute Justice League book or something, but if they can keep it, around 9 or 10 titles, I think there's a real good chance that DC could really turn this success they're having now and keep it long term. I think you could probably have a second Batman book spill into them, and you could do a lot of different things. But I do just hope in the Absolute Universe, at least, whether they keep the main universe or not, what I do hope the Absolute Universe maintains is I do hope it doesn't just turn into what the New 52 did, where it was supposed to be a fresh start, where it's supposed to be something for people who had been out of continuity for a while. You got to kick back in, and then after 2 or 3 years, it started being, hey, we're bringing everything back and everything's back on the table. And as sad as it is, I'm sure for some fans in the New 52, I know there were Wally fans and Stephanie Brown fans and Cassandra Cain fans who were probably not happy that your character was gone. And I can certainly understand that. I do think to compromise an entire line of comic books with the idea of we have to bring back everything and all of these old characters and some stuff's still in continuity, some stuff's not. Making Batman's whole career seem like it happened within 5 years, but like Superman's in a completely different place. It just doomed it. And I do hope the Absolute Universe can at least keep the distinctions that it seems to have right now, where it's new, it's fresh. You may not love every piece of it, but I do think at the very least it's delivering on that so far. But just sad. I think if you go back and read some of those new 52 books, especially stuff with Aquaman, Shazam, some of the Justice League stuff is really, really solid. Man has a great run. It's so weird to go back and see such high quality with some of the books, especially in terms of the art and the creative teams that were on those. And be like, man, this line failed, like failed within 5 years. It's kind of crazy, but it almost seems again like DC just couldn't get out of their own way. And I do hope they won't do that with the Absolute Universe they have going right now, because while I will say I am not the biggest fan of what they've done, the sales are certainly showing it could have some long-term appeal. And I think if they keep it small and concentrated, maybe the way the New 52 should have been, it might see some long-term success. Let me know though, guys, what do you think down below? Why do you think the New 52 failed? Did you become a fan of the New 52, kind of like me? Was it something where you look at it back and have like a thing of, man, what if that had kept going? And do you think the Absolute Universe could be the future of DC Comics, to where that becomes a more wide-ranging line that could ultimately maybe even replaces the main continuity? As always, folks, thank you so much for watching. God bless you. We'll catch you in our next video.